Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeologists in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University. I'm joined by several distinguished guests. Co-host Dr. Larry Geraty, also connected with the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology. Kendra Holoviak-Valentine, who is a professor of New Testament Studies, also at La Sierra University, and Dr. Kent Bramlett, associate professor of Archaeology and History of Antiquity at La Sierra. And we have been working, at least some of us have been working our way through the Bible, through many episodes of Excavating the Bible, and we are now turning to the New Testament. We've spent a bit of time, for your information, Kendra, on the time between the Testaments.
Oh, good.
So that we hope that there is some archaeological, historical, biblical sort of connections that will help us read the New Testament better. That at least is our goal.
And I'm so glad that Kendra is here with us, because the three of us, the others of us, have been at home in the Old Testament for so long that sometimes we don't do justice to the New Testament, so we're glad you're here.
Right.
Thanks for inviting me.
And now that we're walking through the Bible, we turn our attention to the Gospels. We're not going chronologically through the New Testament. We're coming kind of canonically, so we're moving with the Gospels first. And we'll have a chance to talk about when these Gospels were written a bit later. But we're looking at the Gospels, and Kendra, your love of the Gospel is well known, and you've been talking about and teaching the Gospels for a long time. So we're looking forward to your contributions, and then you, I'm assuming, are looking to us for some archaeological stuff.
Yes.
This is a mutually beneficial learning experience that we'll have. Gospels, when we think about the Gospels, how does that resonate? I'm going to hold your thoughts till last, Kendra, because I think I know where you are and how enthusiastic you can get about the Gospels. But what do you think, Larry and Kent, when somebody says we're going to read from the Gospels?
Well, Gospels, of course, is related to good news, and we always think of Jesus and the importance he is to our faith and our relationship to him. So the Gospels is the place you go to find out all about that.
Okay.
Well, I think of a compressed time component there. I mean, most of the stories in the Gospels, except for the birth narratives in the Gospels where they occur, are just in, we say, 3.5 years or so. And there's a lot of action, a lot of activity, a lot of connections we can make with the archaeological remains, at least the physical sorts of objects, things that Jesus talks about and uses as object lessons. So I like the Gospels.
Kendra, what has excited you about the Gospels?
One of the things I have enjoyed of late is the idea that not only do we learn about the Gospels from the time in which the events occurred, Jesus' life, but to also think about them in terms of the time in which they were being written and how the people were writing these stories down decades after they occurred to meet needs that were present later on. And so how do you tell the Jesus story in a new situation? And it's the question that those of us who are preachers and teachers are asking too. How do we today tell the Jesus story in ways that are relevant to our current questions and issues and what's going on in our world?
Because our culture and our world is not the same as an early Roman world, nor a Palestinian one, nor anything in the ancient world.
And we all do the same thing when we talk to our families about past experiences, don't we? The longer we live, we look back and we see our early lives as connected to, of course you wouldn't know that yet, but I'm speaking for myself when I'm talking to my grandchildren.
I would know that now.
Well, and the stories are usually better over time, so they improve. Okay, we have a few artifacts in front of us, and Kent, I want you to begin on your end of the table to think about particularly writing and communicating through written word.
Well, the New Testament is fun because we have such an increase in the amount of written materials that we can relate, both contemporary inscriptions, which we find in archaeological contexts, such as tombstones. They can tell us about names that were common, about beliefs, about a number of aspects, really. Sometimes there are larger monumental inscriptions, which might tell us who built a structure, Sometimes we can make direct connections. Something like this brick with an inscribed stamp on it that identifies this brick as being built or laid by the 10th Legion. Right there we have a connection with the siege of Jerusalem under Titus, and then, well, Vespasian and then Titus, who captures Jerusalem. The 10th Legion was right up there on the Mount Scopus, that extension of the Mount of Olives. So texts are so wonderful when we can find them, and we find a lot more in the New Testament time period than we do going back to the earlier times of Israel. Of course, scrolls. Much material was written on scrolls, and most of the time scrolls didn't survive the ravages of time, except in unusual circumstances. Everybody thinks of Qumran, of course. Right. These scrolls being tucked away in jars in caves down in the dry desert. So in some situations, we do have the actual texts from the time of Jesus that he would have been familiar with.
Now the papyrus, we have this roll of papyrus, not so much surviving of, I mean, in Qumran there are a few fragments, but that would not last as long as parchment or vellum, right?
Well, in the conditions around Jerusalem, it's quite wet, so nothing would survive. It probably wouldn't survive quite as well. But in Egypt, you know, the sands are full of parchments. Yeah, so in the right location, we have an incredible trove of resources to really broaden our understanding of the first century.
When things are constantly dry, they're well preserved, or if they're constantly in water, they can be well preserved, like in a well. But when it goes back and forth, dry, wet, that's what destroys these things.
And mummification happens quite naturally. Animals walk into a tomb, and if they die, people think it's this mysterious process, but no, in the Egyptian desert, it just desiccates them.
Now, there are a couple of smaller artifacts in front of the inscriptions. What would people concerned with writing be doing with lamps?
We think of the scribal process of writing, or certainly reading. In dim light, interiors of buildings didn't have electric lights. Small windows, out of practicality. You don't want this great big opening when you have inclement weather. So lamps would allow you to read. And people didn't spend hours in the easy chair in the evenings reading. No. You know, this is burning valuable food. Olive oil could be eaten, or it could be burned for light. It's an economic resource of
and those are all Herodian, so they all belong to this time period we're talking about?
They do, yes. These are all
and tell us how you know that they're all dated to the first century.
Well, the design, the shape is a development of the earlier Hellenistic lamp, isn't it? And these have a nice circular, the typical ones like the one over here, is a nice circular shape to the body, and then this flaring spout, which is very characteristic of Herodian lamps from around Jerusalem. Very little or no iconography on them because of the religious sensitivities. And this develops then into the later Byzantine sequence, which we don't have illustrated right here. But these lamps were used. You can still see the black, the soot black around the nozzle. Okay.
Larry, a few comments.
Yeah, here's a collection of pots that come from the Roman period. We look at this shape and think of what's called a pilgrim flask. This is an exceptionally large one. Sometimes they're much smaller. A bowl, obviously, and you see all the ribbing that's characteristic of this period. This one we were talking about earlier, and if the camera can look at the top there, you can see that it's for liquid because it's got very small holes. And then the cooking pot, if you want to know what a cooking pot looked like in the time of Jesus, there's one that has been used and had a lot of stew in it, I'm sure. So they're typical.
And you know, we have lots of vessels that would carry liquids like this one, but this one is different because it would prevent the spilling. So this is something that would be portable. This is something you would carry, maybe with extra oil. And we think about the story of the maidens and so on. This is a larger one that I've seen before, but maybe it's something like that we have to keep in mind. Well, then let's take a look at some illustrations and think about the book, and then think about some manuscripts. We're talking about the Gospels in general. We'll get close to some of the stories in the later episodes. Kent, we have some chronology here. Just quickly, what the highlighted part.
Well, we revisit the Herods, so descendants of Herod the Great, his sons becoming regional rulers, tetrarchs, ethnarchs, we could call them. Herod Archelaus didn't last long. He had the Judea around the Jerusalem area and was too radical. Herod Antipas did quite well, governing Galilee and across the Jordan, Perea. Philip, also, we don't hear much about him. He's more peripheral, up in what's now the Golan Heights and up towards Syria. But these were important to the, to the texture of the political scene in the first century.
Now, the next slide is going to have some highlighted Herodian rulers, and they're here because they cover the time period when these books are written. Mm-hmm. What can we know, Kendra, about the time of writing? You talked before about the situations that the writers faced.
Right.
But in what century? Or, I'm sorry, in which decades would these books be written?
The first thing we probably should do is be super humble about this. Yes. None of the gospel writers date or sign them. But there are lots of textual clues and hints that would suggest that the first gospel that was written, of those that are in our canons, our New Testament, probably was the Gospel of Mark. And it was probably written at the end of the 60s into the early 70s of that first century. So probably Mark writing at a time of terrible persecution and conflict and a lot of suffering going on for people. And it would make sense that that's when you would write down the story of Jesus, for fear that those who had remembered the story orally would not survive. Mm-hmm. So the Gospel of Mark, most likely the first gospel, and then Matthew and Luke, probably late 70s, maybe into the 80s, and the last gospel. There's debate about all of this, but placing the Gospel of John more in the 90s. Because of some of the slides we'll look at later, we know for sure it's been written by 125,
That's right.
that the Gospel of John. But probably in the late 90s, the Gospel of John is
facing
written.
More persecution, this time under a different emperor,
situation, that's right.
And meeting needs in a different sort of way.
Right.
Especially when you move then to Revelation,
right.
To the Apocalypse and to Revelation.
And when you think about them writing when there's this delay, assuming that Jesus was going to return right away, it makes sense that you wouldn't have written a gospel earlier.
Right.
You wouldn't have, because most people couldn't read and write. Instead, you tell the stories, you share them verbally. But then as there's more and more of a delay, writing these stories down.
Right. As we look at the map, fairly generic map, but it is Judea, Samaria, Idumea, and the Decapolis cities, Perea, the region of Jesus' ministry, certainly the gospel stories.
Jews hated to go from Galilee to Judea and back and forth because they had to go through Samaria, didn't they? Which was not a very welcome place.
No, and a lot of literature about why, and some backstory to those reasons. That's why Jesus actually ends up going through Perea a lot. Well, at least we hear about going through Perea a lot. The big issues, okay? How these came about. Kendra, you've talked about that a bit. Synoptic, kind of defined that for us. Kendra, you are the scholar now to do this. And Q. What is Q? Because if you read about, in any literature that would be academic in any way, you're going to bump into Q. You're going to bump into the synoptic problem. So talk to us about that.
Synoptic is two words put together from the Greek, synoptic, similar, syn, optic, like your eye, right? Similar perspective, similar point of view. And so we're referring here to the synoptic gospels as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're the three that sound similar a lot of the time. And the synoptic problem, which in class I like to put quotation marks around that, because
it's not really a problem
for a lot of us.
We're lucky to have it all.
That's right, that's right. But for some, and that's the historic name or phrase that's given to this question, of how is it possible that we have three gospels that at times are word for word the same at times? At times, word for word the same in the original language. How is that possible? And we talk about this in class. You know, if I get 3 papers in, and they are word for word the same at times,
we have
a problem, right? And so how is it? And as we wrestle with this, we sometimes say, well, if the same God is inspiring all 3, maybe that's why we have. But then there's the flip side to that. Why are they ever different? Because they're all so different. So how to wrestle with this question of word for word the same at times? The synoptic problem has come up with a 2-source solution. And the 2-source solution says that the first gospel that was written is Mark, and then there is this source called Q. And it's kind of by process of elimination, looking at what Matthew and Luke have in common that's not in Mark. Well, there must have been another document source that the 2 of them were using. And this Q source, from the word Quelle, source in the German, this other source, a hypothetical source of collection of Jesus' sayings that Matthew drew on and Luke drew on. And this is a way to explain how Mark, Matthew, and Luke could all be word for word the same at times, drawing on each other and a saying source, collection of Jesus' sayings, and creating their gospels through an inspired experience of seeing and being blessed by an earlier gospel. Matthew and then Luke incorporate some of that material into their own gospels.
I like to think about the biblical literature as carrying divine credentials, so we think about the inspiration, but lots of human fingerprints.
That's a nice way of saying it.
We've got the human fingerprints here. We ought not be afraid of that.
Right.
I mean, who else is God going to use to communicate through? So a nice explanation.
I would also say that in the first century world, to copy someone's work was not to steal it. You didn't even put your name on it, but it was to honor it, to say, I was blessed by this work, and therefore I want to incorporate it so that more people will experience it.
You even have schools or disciples of each of these major. I mean, we end up with a book from Mark. Mark had a community. Matthew the same. And so these grow out. It seems to me that these books grow out of communities. They're not just one author sitting down, writing one thing, all of these things going on.
There's some interesting scholarship right now as we speak where people are looking at the Gospel of Mark and saying, was it so much of a community that people had actually memorized it and shared it dramatically? And was it experienced sort of as a dramatic portrayal of these stories? Really interesting.
Which would be interesting. Well,
Very
actually,
interesting.
a number of people have done those dramatic things, and they are. It's a different dynamic.
It really is.
It totally is. So we look at some of these. A quick outline, and Kendra, I'm going to turn to you again. A quick outline of Mark, Matthew, Luke. I'm going to do in the chronological order you've stated, and just say a word or two about these outlines.
First half of the Gospel of Mark. Immediately, Jesus, immediately. You got to kind of catch your breath to keep up with Jesus.
Yeah.
Get to the halfway point of the gospel.
Changes.
Slows down dramatically. And of course, this is the point in the gospel narrative where Jesus is saying, I'm headed to the cross. So you have this fascinating first half of the book. He's preaching, he's teaching, he's healing people, he's casting out demons. They're excited. Yes, this is Messiah. This has got to be the Messiah. Don't you think this is the Messiah? Gets to the middle of the book and says, you're right. I am the Messiah, the Christ, but I'm headed to a cross.
Yes.
And the whole tone changes, and the focal point, and the incredible inspired writing of this author that would say, that's how I'm going to fashion the story, to me is so moving.
Hinges on the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi.
Right, and the first time Jesus is saying, I'm headed to a cross. And Peter says, no, Jesus, don't talk like that. That's depressing.
That's correct.
Right, absolutely. It's just a stunning scene, isn't it? Right in the middle of the book.
Okay, what about Matthew?
Matthew's gospel told around 5 times when Jesus stops and speaks for lengthy periods of time. The 5 discourses are sermons, the first being the most famous, the Sermon on the Mount, but 4 other ones as well, where if you have a red letter Bible where Jesus is speaking and it is placed in red, huge sections of all red in your Bible, 5 times through the Gospel of Matthew. And a nice way of thinking about the story.
Not so much same organization in Luke.
Correct. Focused, I would say, after a fascinating start, and we're learning about Jesus as a baby as well as John the Baptist's story, the infancy narratives. You have at chapter 9, verse 51, a lengthy travel narrative. Jesus sets his face, Scripture says, to go to Jerusalem. He sets his face. He heads there. He's determined. It's going to be a roundabout way.
Is it the same trigger? Is it the same? Do we have Peter and Peter's role in the confession in the same way? We don't have the same.
I'd have to double check that, but I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it's a slightly different way of telling the story.
Now, John. What about John?
Not a synoptic.
No, okay.
That's the first thing we could say.
Right.
Not a synoptic. The Gospel according to John, this beautiful poetry at the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then the first half of the book, these signs. They're not called miracles.
No.
Signs, because they're pointing somewhere. Don't get fixated on the sign. Notice where it's pointing to. So that's the first half of the book, and then the second half focused on the passion of Jesus.
So, got some variation here.
Variation.
Which adds so much richness and depth
It really does.
to our understanding of the Gospels. So, some issues that we could talk about, these will actually govern much of our conversation throughout the New Testament. Issues of the Roman Empire and what it means to be under the control of the empire, and the influence of other powers, and then what was local and so on. We're not going to pause on that right now, but we will have occasion to talk about it later.
And when you understand that, it provides such a rich background to the passages. We see them in new ways when we understand the original context.
Probably more authentic ways.
Right.
We probably should add that.
Right.
So not just different, but probably more authentic. Texts, inscriptions. Kent, exactly how many New Testament manuscripts are there?
As of when? Yeah.
Well, it does keep changing, doesn't it?
It does.
So if we think about the New Testament, how many Greek manuscripts? Okay, we can just use general number in thousands.
I don't have a number to throw out.
5 to 6 at this point?
We were counting fragments, certainly, at this point.
Right. But thousands of them. There were no Xerox machines. There was no copy duplicating. And so people were writing these things like crazy, which means, and this is typically how it happens, that the variations tend to explode because they're writing so many things and then comes back to what we call the received text, which kind of covers over all of those, that diversity. I think there's a lot of life in these variations, and we ought not be afraid of them. They're part of the life of the text of the Gospels.
And people who study those and try to get to an original, it's called lower criticism sometimes, right? Textual criticisms, and that's something that many people have been involved in.
Right. So we're going to look at some of these. Kendra, you've talked about spending a little bit of time with some of the non-canonical Gospels. What this book title is saying is that there were others.
Right.
So were there others?
There were others. And telling different kinds of stories. Often, it seems to me, in the little bit of study I've done on the non-biblical Gospels, is that it seems to me that people were wanting to fill in some of the gaps about Jesus' life. What happened when he was a toddler? What happened when he was a teenager? What happened? What were his grandparents like? Do we know anything about Mary's parents? And these kinds of questions would lead to other stories to kind of fill in those gaps from what we have in the canonical.
And in our next episode, we'll be looking precisely at the childhood and the youth years of Jesus and what these other Gospels have to say. So we'll think about them. Another one, how do we say this word, Kent?
Oxyrhynchus. It's a good anglicization.
And it comes, this is Egyptian then?
It comes from Egypt.
Right. Where we have better preservation for papyri, like we've looked at. So this is a collection of sayings of Jesus. The Q scholars haven't looked at this, I don't think. Maybe they have. Okay.
And archaeologists would be excited to find that Q source, wouldn't they?
Wouldn't that be amazing?
In a papyrus.
Right.
I tell my students it won't be called Q.
No, right, right.
Another example, a gospel, as it is called, a gospel of the Savior. What would you say, 30, 40, 50 of these other gospels? What do you think, Kendra?
Ooh, I don't know the exact number,
Right.
but I would.
There are a number of them.
Right. We usually talk about. I usually talk about about 12 of them in class,
Right.
to kind of the more familiar ones.
Right. And I've seen a number of about 30, but I don't know the research lately, and I'm not sure if there are others that have been discovered. So, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. That would be interesting to read.
It is.
Kent, a famous name here.
Yes, Tischendorf. It's the one who, well, he would like to say he discovered it. He went to St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai, and he claims, this is about 1844, so it's an easy date to remember, but he claims that the local monks were cleaning out some of the old manuscripts and throwing the pages into the fire. Now, his version of that is questioned nowadays, and the Orthodox Church strongly contends that they were not indeed throwing them away. So it may have been a part of a story he concocted to legitimize his removal of the manuscript. But it's our oldest, one of our oldest manuscripts of the Bible. It's in Greek, and you can imagine the excitement going to a remote location, finding codex or book after book and scrolls of ancient manuscripts, and each one just discovering what it is. So this was a sense of great discovery and exploration at that time, and we owe that, at least in part, to Tischendorf.
And it's
Because
not,
up until that time, the manuscripts were medieval, right? And so
That's right.
going back to the 4th century was really an exciting
well, and it's the
time.
oldest complete Bible.
Right.
And it has more than our Bible. That's why I put it in here. It's, it doesn't have other Gospels, but it does have other books that don't show up in our traditional Protestant Bible in any case. So more from Codex Sinaiticus, another Oxyrhynchus papyrus, this one of the book of James. Another one, this one is Gospel, and shows us the range, a lot of them coming out of Egypt, but the range of Gospels that do that. And another one from Oxyrhynchus, a great producer of papyri. And then this one, and this is the last one we'll have time to talk about. Kendra, what's so important about this particular piece of papyrus?
Once this was dated to 125, one could move the creation of the Gospel of John earlier to the 1st century rather than so much later. So the discovery of this particular papyrus was quite groundbreaking for John studies, Gospel studies.
Because up until this time, people had dated John later.
Way into the 2nd century.
Into the 2nd century.
Right. I think from John 18 and 19?
Yes,
Something like that.
18.
And these are actually two sides of the same piece. So, I mean, this is not inexpensive to get, and so you use everything you can.
Right.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Kendra and Kent, and all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope that you have benefited intellectually and spiritually, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring.